Choosing the right lab for your PhD is the single most important factor that decides your success and your happiness during your PhD. Many people often try to find a lab based on the research focus of the lab. And while this is a very popular way to choose a lab, honestly, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. The first reason is many people decide to choose their lab based on the research description on a lab website. And these websites are often outdated. They often include a very vague description of what research is actually being done in the lab. If you really want to know what research is being done by a specific lab, look up that professor on Google Scholar and look at their recent publications, and that will give you the best idea of what research the lab has been doing. And if you want to know what research that lab will be going towards, the best way to find this out is to either contact a grad student or the professor themselves and just ask them which direction their lab is going in. And I know that was a little bit of a tangent, but choosing a lab based on the research focus is sounds great, but it only works if the PI is a good match for you. I think the PI student match is infinitely more important than the topic of the research that you are going to be doing. If you do not like your advisor, if your advisor doesn't like you, if there's something off, if you don't like your relationship, no matter how much you enjoy that research, you're not going to have a good time in your PhD. Another thing to consider when you're looking at the research focus is whether or not your lab is part of a center. And this is something that I overlooked when I was choosing a lab. Thankfully, because I'm co-advised, one of my PIs has an affiliation with a cardiovascular center. And even though I do not do cardiovascular research, the fact that I'm technically in the cardiovascular center opens me up to so many more resources than I would have if I were not part of that center. So honestly, it is not something trivial to overlook. Being part of a center opens up many opportunities for you, both socially and for your experiments as well. There may be more tools and resources for you to actually do your experiments. So I talked a lot about how your PI is the single most important determinant of your success and happiness in your PhD. But how do you actually research? How do you know what a PI is going to be like? Now, obviously, the best way to find this out is if your program has some kind of a rotation system. So my program has a 2-quarter rotation system where you can take, the department will fund you for 2 whole quarters. So each quarter is 10 weeks, and you do a rotation project in a lab. And basically by the end of those 2 quarters, you have to decide which lab that you're going to choose. And this is really nice if you're only deciding between 2 options, but oftentimes it can be quite difficult to narrow down your options from the entire faculty list to just 2 options. So I'll talk about how to narrow that down. And also, not every school has a rotation system, and many students actually come in pre-matched. For example, maybe they only got into that PhD program because a specific lab like them or a specific professor knows them, then you kind of have to join that lab. So for example, in my case, I did undergraduate research in the lab that I'm doing my PhD in, so I was pre-matched. I never did a rotation. So how do you find out if your PI is going to be a good match? One, is to figure out what their funding situation is. And this can be a really tricky topic to get into. At least for me at the start, I didn't really want to get into this because this is not something that many professors are very open about. It's great if they are, but I think especially you have to be comfortable bringing up these kinds of topics to even have a good relationship with your advisor in general. So if you're considering joining a lab, make sure to ask about the funding situation. The reason why this is so important is because the quality of your experience is often dependent on how your funding situation looks like. Maybe your professor doesn't have funding, and you would have, if you were to join their lab, you would have to TA every single quarter, which would significantly slow down your research progress. And you might think that's not a great thing, that's not a bad thing, but um, imagine this. So let's say you're TAing every quarter that you're a PhD because your professor doesn't have funding. Because you're TAing so much, your research progress is very slow. Therefore, your PI gets frustrated that you're not producing the level of research output that they expect from you, then gets resentful, passive aggressive, and then you get resentful that they're being resentful, and it becomes this whole negative spiral of your relationship with your PI tanking. All of this can be solved by a very honest conversation at the very beginning about what the funding situation is like. Um, Obviously, things may change throughout the course of your PhD, but this will set a good foundation to at least enable conversations about funding. In my situation, the two sources of funding are either, or three sources are one, fellowship, two, TAing, and three is being a graduate student researcher. In my case, I'm a graduate student researcher. Essentially is the professor's grant money funding you. And this typically, this is how I've been funded for the entirety of my PhD so far, and it makes it so that I do not have to TA for my PhD. However, this depends from lab to lab. That's just my case, but it really warrants a conversation with your potential PI. The next thing to look at when you're looking at a potential PI is the publication record. So like I said before, look up the professor on Google Scholar and look up how often is this professor publishing their research. You can even look by the first authors, those are going to be the students in their lab, how many first author papers often come out of that lab by a single author. That will typically tell you how many papers that you need to graduate from this lab, so that'll give you an idea of the expectations of the PI, and two, whether or not the publication record aligns with your career goals. For example, if you want to go into academia, publishing papers is extremely important. So you want to find a lab that publishes papers at a very high frequency. If you are not going into academia, let's say maybe you're going into industry and publications don't matter as much to you, then maybe this is not something that's super relevant to you. But it's still something to take into account, and it can give you an idea of what the professor's expectations for you are. In my department, in general, the expectation is 3 first author papers to graduate. However, this really, really varies in a case-by-case basis. Finally, the best thing that you can do to research a PI is to talk to graduate students in the program. Even if they're not in that lab, grad students typically know the reputations of every single PI in that department. For example, I kind of have an idea of what every single PI is like just from hearing things about their students, right? Obviously, you'll get the best representation of what a PI is like by talking to their student or their previous student. But just talking to graduate students in general will give you a really good idea of what a professor is like, and that'll help you gauge what your relationship with them will be like. A specific question to ask is what the PI's mentorship style is. Are they a very hands-on micromanaging type person, or are they a hands-off type of person? In my case, I have two PIs, one of which is the very standard, you meet every week, you're expected to present your research updates, and besides that one meeting, it's very hands-off, once a week. My other PI is even more hands-off, so maybe I'll meet with them maybe like once a month or so. And this really depends. You really need to ask these questions beforehand. I know some PIs who really micromanage every single thing that their students do, down to even having the students log in what time that they're in the lab. I think that's a little excessive, in my opinion. However, you really need to talk to people to figure out what it's going to be like before you trap yourself into 5+ years of living in that situation. Another question you can ask current graduate students are, what careers have students who have graduated from this lab pursued? So for example, is every single graduate from this lab going into academia? That will tell you that this is a good lab if you want to go into academia. If every single person from a lab is going into industry, that's probably a good lab that will set you up very well for industry. And not only is that true on its own, the relationships that you can get through your PI, many jobs in the academic circle are really gained by basically networking, and it's about who you know. And your professor's connections are honestly a very big factor in your future career. You can kind of look at the trajectory and the kind of connections they have based on the careers that their past students have gone into. For example, if your PI has a track record of sending students to from maybe like FAANG companies in your example, then if you wanted to join a FAANG company, this is a great place to be. However, if you wanted to go into academia and your lab has never produced an academic before, you're going to have to work a lot harder than someone who joined a lab that produces a lot of academics to get into that same career. Finally, something that cannot be overlooked is the lab culture. This is also something that you can gauge by asking the current students in the lab, but the fundamental question here is that, will you like your potential coworkers? You don't realize this at the time. I definitely did not realize this at the time, but your lab mates are going to be some of the people that you spend the majority of your time with for 5 years. That is a serious amount of time. You're going to spend a lot of time with these people. If for example, if you have a great relationship with your PI, you love the research, but you hate your coworkers, it's going to get to you over the course of 5 years. It's critical to talk to your potential coworkers, see if these are the kind of people that you can at least get along with, because you're going to spend so much time with them. And some other things to consider are, what is the culture like? When are you expected to be in the lab? Is this a lab where you're expected to work 9 to 5, or is this the kind of lab that's more flexible? Is this the kind of lab that will have socials once a quarter, once a week? I don't know. Or is this the kind of lab that's strictly business? Who knows? These are the kind of questions that you can ask of the graduate students, or literally anyone who has worked in the lab. Anyway, that is my insight on how to choose your lab for your PhD. This is going to be one of the most important decisions of your career, and honestly of your life. And if you'd like me to help you choose a lab, click the link in the description.